Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. Usually by now, Laura and I will be catching up with each other in our recent reads, but we're saving that conversation for when she's over from Vancouver and we can do it in person here in London in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, I was delighted to have the opportunity to talk books and recommendations with one of my favourite book podcasters, Christopher Hermelin from So Many Damn Books. For the book clubber trying to figure out the most interesting authors to read, Christopher's guest list is a great place to start. Whether household names like George Saunders or Ruth Ozeki, or up-and-coming stars on the literary scene, you'll get insight into the writing process as well as discovering literary influences and, of course, book recommendations. As a keen cocktail enthusiast, Christopher also takes great delight in crafting a cocktail for each guest inspired by their book. Much like the cocktails though, Christopher also likes to occasionally mix up his format. And we began our chat discussing a recent episode in which he and his wife Sarah talked about their bookish pet peeves. What peeves could two devoted readers possibly have, I wondered. It turns out Christopher struggled more than Sarah to come up with some.
As my wife says on the show, she is a hater. She's happy to throw a book aside and say, that wasn't for me. And I'm always worried that it's my fault and I'm the wrong reader for the book, not the book is the wrong book for me. And that hard line is fascinating to me, and it made me realize I do have some of my own. But I'm always trying to reconsider them and pick that idea back up. Do I really hate that sort of thing? Because maybe I just didn't like that one book at that one time, and then I've made this whole wall around that area for no reason. So I try not to have pet peeves. And yet, I do have one that I'll talk about forever, which is talking around pop culture references. If they don't want to make a pop culture reference, but they do want to, they'll talk about Jaws, but they'll say like the blockbuster shark movie. And it's just, it sounds like you've forgotten the title, not like you're stylistically making a choice.
Yeah, or are they tiptoeing around some kind of legal, can you not reference something in a very specific way without somehow being like liable or having to pay a fee or something? I wondered if it was that. Maybe there's some reason why people do it.
I think the biggest one is that they don't want to date their book. They don't want to fully make it tied to a specific time period and pop culture. But it is. Even if they didn't name all that stuff, it still is tied to the time period it came out. And it's, especially if it's a contemporary novel about contemporary things, I think it's very strange. It just feels false. To me, that's really important in the grand idea of why am I reading it all? Connecting to contemporary culture and trying to make sense of the world that we are in together is such an important reason to be reading contemporary fiction. That is what I feel like I'm reading. I'm reading the books where people are like sifting it through and they're trying to find the ways that it makes sense and pulling out those details that will make me rethink my relation to the world. That's a big reason why I read contemporary fiction at all. I know people who are like, I don't want to read anything published after 1970. And it's just, wait a minute, that seems like you're missing a whole... I guess you only want to read the classics, but why not make your own classics? It's the 2020s, and I want to read what people are doing now. And the 70s, like all of it.
So that was one thing. The other thing I loved was Sarah's avowed hatred of something that made me laugh so much when she said it. She really doesn't like when a book has a map at the beginning, which I had never thought it could be something that would bother anyone. But I loved her justification for it. I was like, oh yeah, you're right. Actually, she was saying it's great that the author has done all this research to the point where they're then able to create this meticulous cartographic representation of this imaginary realm that they've created. And isn't that marvelous? But I don't need to see that. I don't have to navigate my way around this imaginary place. Don't waste my time.
I think that for her too, it's an indicator. It's maybe they're actually saying like, I didn't do a very good job. So you're going to have to flip back to this map to make sense of it because I didn't do it. Maybe. So I think that's part of it. It's just like, this might be not for me. No. Especially modern fantasy, I think it can really fall back on their maps.
Yeah, it made me laugh. She's right. For me, I have this great affection for them because It taps into my childhood reading where, then you're really interested in the map, aren't you? Like at the beginning of The Hobbit, it's great to be able to see, oh yeah, this is where they went.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a grown-up reader, I don't really need the map in the same way.
Yeah, I remember feeling like that was probably a very important part of book writing. As a kid, it was like, okay, I'm going to write my book.
You're going to need a map.
The first thing that I'm going to do is make a map. I think that still holds true in that I've been working on a book for a while, and I made a map of the apartment where the characters live. But again, I need that. The people who read the book, they better not need that. They better be able to picture that apartment.
So,
speaking of books,
what have you been reading recently?
I just finished reading this book by Dave Eggers. He's a fantastic novelist and started the 826 Valencia writers training workshop that are all over the United States. And this new book, The Eyes and the Impossible, is actually a book for young readers. And it won the Newbery Award, which is a really big children's award out here. And it's narrated by a dog, which gets my heart racing because I love animal narrated books. I know that's some people's hard line, bookish pet peeve. Absolutely not. I'm never going to read a book narrated by an animal, but I am always on board. It's set in a park, and this dog, he's a wild dog. He doesn't want to be caught. He just wants to live in the park with his friends. There's some bison in an enclosure that are like the wise men of the park, and he goes and sees them. He calls himself the Eyes because he runs around the park, and if there's anything interesting, anything going on, he knows about it. And they're building a museum in the park, and he finds himself drawn to the museum, and it causes all sorts of trouble because he really wants to look at the art, and he can't because he's going to be caught. I think the project of an animal narrator is fascinating because you get to see these details through a completely different point of view. And if the author is doing a good job, they're embodying an animal to pull at details that you never really would have thought of before to look at. You feel joy that, oh, there's a full trash can. He's so excited about that because he knows that's the best buffet in the park. And these little things, and then just the idea that a dog would be into art and it would stop him in his tracks is such a beautiful, weird thought. There ends up being a plot to the book, but it's so incidental. And to think that kids are finding this and thinking of what it means to be a good citizen, that's so much of what the book is about, is what does it mean to be a good park citizen, and how can you live in harmony with what's around you. And I think that's something that, of course, kids are going to relate to, but I think adults get it too. I can see why this is winning awards and why Dave Eggers was drawn to tell this story next. I've been following his career for so long, and it's just, I couldn't believe that he was going to write a dog book because it just seemed so outside of his usual thing. He's been writing all sorts of different genres, but I never thought a dog book would be next, which is what's great about him. You never really know what his next book will be. And the audiobook was narrated by Ethan Hawke. So he is doing an incredible job. He's got voices for everybody. And one of my little favorite things is the dog is friends with raccoons. And the voices that he gives the raccoons, the idea that the raccoons are so bored by all the other animals because they have little hands, so they're always being asked for favors to open things. And there's a wonderful sequence where he needs to not look wild, so the animals all help him pull on a pink dog sweater. It's just so enjoyable.
Oh, it sounds great. I'm not sure it's come out here. What's it called?
The Eyes and the Impossible. I think it'll probably make its way over.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually, soon.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm just guessing that's why I hadn't heard anything about it. I don't think it's not on my radar at all. But yeah, I love him, and I agree. Like you, I've been watching his career and just being amazed by him for so long, ever since that first book, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. What an incredible book that was. I
think about that advance breakdown. He talks about what his advance for the book at the very beginning, what it went to. And I think about that all the time. I don't think that's ever really been far from my head since I first read it.
I haven't reread it properly, but I was actually dipping into it again not so long ago. I found it on my shelf and I pulled it down and I was enjoying remembering how I felt. Sometimes books take you back. The reread takes you back to when you read it the first time. And I was really enjoying this little nostalgia trip of going back to the first time I read that book. And I like that we weren't wrong about him, were we? When I read that book, I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is a special writer who's written a really exciting book. And we were right. He went on to do amazing things.
He really did. He released this other book. It was this little box of 3 writers writing flash fiction. Mm-hmm. And it was his flash fiction and then Deb Olin Unferth and then somebody else. And it was just this little box of like over 100 stories. And it was such a massive text for me that unlocked what you can do with just a few words for telling a story. That you only need half a page maybe to get an enormous amount of story going. It makes sense for me that he then turned to an animal narrator because that is a way to pull out observation that might feel precious or twee coming from a person, but coming from a dog, it suddenly gains a new valence. But again, you have to be on board with the project to work. You can't be asking, why do they know this human word and not that one? You know, if that's the way that you're reading a dog book, it's going to fall apart.
But my favorite ever McSweeney's project that they ever did was the newspaper.
Oh, that was so cool.
It was the best
I was
thing.
Living in San Francisco at that time.
So did they give it out?
They did. And they also had some newspaper boys.
Oh, I love this so
selling
much.
It.
So it was basically, a Sunday, it was like they took the format of the Sunday New York Times or here, one of the big Sunday broadsheets where you've got all these sections. And then they really played around them with the sports section, the culture section was just the best ever. They did a comic section. That was so great.
Yeah, I think Chris Ware edited the comic section. That was such a cool project. Although, even though I bought it, I didn't keep it because it really fell apart. It was a newspaper. Like, all of their other objects are such, like, permanent ones to me. But that one, definitely, it yellowed until I couldn't read it anymore, and I purged it away.
I'm sure that's probably what they wanted. I still have mine, though. Just the best thing. Perhaps from that, and going back to his book, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, which at the time felt like quite a provocative title, certainly something that gets your attention. I recently read a book called How I Won a Nobel Prize by an author called Julius Taranto. So this is an American book. It just came out here. It's a novel. And it's written from the point of view of a female physicist. She's a computational physicist, I believe. So there's a lot of very technical stuff in here about her day job and what she's doing. And the Nobel element is she works with a more senior physicist who has won a Nobel Prize. What they're working on, their specific area that they are interested in is superconductivity.
Okay.
So the way this is explained in the book is that when energy is transmitted, like for example down a wire, it loses energy in the process. And so as a result, it's difficult to get energy around. At one point, she explains it's why laptops get hot. It's because they're emitting energy. But there are some materials that are at incredibly low temperatures, like absolute zero, can conduct electricity without any loss. So it's like this kind of frictionless energy transfer. But what we can't do, what we don't know how to do, is to have that frictionless energy transfer happen at room temperature. And so this is what they're working on. They're working on trying to figure out how to come up with a way of transferring energy to make everyday ordinary materials into these superconductors. And if we could crack that, we could have a power grid that would transmit energy seamlessly and wouldn't be any energy to maintain. We could have trains running smoothly on brilliantly frictionless tracks. It would lead to all these really amazing things. We could have power through fusion without any risk. It would kind of change the world if we could crack this.
Right.
So in the book, they are working on this problem. So that's the sciencey bit, which actually I really enjoyed. I'm not a sciencey person at all, but weirdly, I really love reading about science. I'm always very happy to read about scientific things.
fiction about science or non-fiction?
This is
about
fiction,
science?
and I guess I have no way of gauging, given that my basic knowledge of the subject, as I'm sure anyone listening to that summary of what's going on is practically zero. So I wouldn't be able to tell if it was all complete hokum or if it was. But I found it very convincing, and I believe this is correctly rooted in what actually is going on in science. It felt very up to date. It felt very well researched, and I loved the way there was this high-low of explaining it, so that you were given just enough. So I reckon whatever your level, you'd be able to engage with it. So that's the background of what's going on. But in order to work with this Nobel-winning physicist, whose name is Perry, he is found to have been having a sexual relationship with a younger man, a student of his. And as such, he's basically cancelled. He can't teach anymore. But in the book, it turns out that there is this new institute that's been set up. It's a kind of anti-Yale. It's on an island called Plymouth Island, which maybe is a real place off the coast of wherever New Haven is. Connecticut, is it? And it's been set up by this billionaire. And it's basically supposed to be a haven for all these people who have been cancelled or can't work in their original academic institutions because of things that they've done. So Perry goes to work at this newly founded institute, and she needs to work with him, Helen, our main character, because she is his graduate student. They've been working on this problem together. There's no one else really she can do this work with at this level. Mm-hmm. It has to be him. So she has to go there. And they go to this place. It says, soon we ascended the hill and moved on to the campus proper. Oak-shaded paths wound through lawns so well kept they looked artificial. Between heavy breaths, Perry identified a former sea captain's house that was now the English department, another stately Victorian that was now philosophy. He identified the homes of winners of various Nobels, the John Bates Clark Medal, the Fields Medal, the Pulitzer, the Best Director Oscar, the Bancroft Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Turner Prize. Here was the home of Senator Metzger, who had worn blackface in college, and the adjacent homes of 3 former Supreme Court justices. Over there, on a large grass ellipse, a Ponzi schemer completed a wobbly pass to an insider trader. There was the intern fucker Vice President McCarmot in a Hawaiian shirt, walking his labradoodle. So the point is that all these people are there, and the billionaire is funding everything, and he wants to give these people a place to live and work. And so what this setup gives you is a very playful look at contemporary culture. I felt moral relativism. I think that is a term I meant to look up because I feel like it's something I think I know, but maybe I don't quite understand. But is it about our constantly evolving positions about what's okay and what's not okay, and people doing things that we now think are not acceptable, but maybe in previous generations they were perfectly fine, and maybe people who had been used to living their whole lives a certain way now having to come to terms with the fact that they can't anymore. It explores all these things. It plays with all these ideas of what's okay and what's not okay. But the reason I enjoyed it so much is because at its heart, there's actually this really great psychological dynamic between our main character, Helen, and different men in her life. So there's her husband, Hugh, who doesn't want to go to the island, is appalled by the very idea of the island. And every second that he's there fights against this terrible place where all these people that he thinks should be cancelled and shouldn't be walking around scot-free have found this sort of happy haven. There's her relationship with the physicist, Perry, and this work that they're doing together, which I found really interesting and exciting. There's a moment when she has a breakthrough in this work that is so electric. You feel like you're discovering it with her. It was so well written. I was just there.
Eureka.
Yes. It was so great. And there's this thriller plot going on underneath where there's this group of anarchists offshore who want to tear the whole place down, like physically. They've got some active plans for how to thwart what's going on. You've got the slightly cartoonish billionaire villain at the top of it all. But it's all done with this very sly, funny nod and a wink that I enjoyed so much. I didn't quite know what to make of it. I just knew how much I enjoyed reading it. It felt really refreshing to me. It felt like I like books that are cleverer than I am. And I'm not that clever. So that's not saying anything. It's more that I love books that surprise me and are not what I expect and take me somewhere or make me stretch my thoughts to keep up. And I felt like this book did all of those things and was very funny and very charming and full of great one-liners about contemporary life.
It sounds great. I love the idea that you can walk away from fiction with newer understanding of physics as well, like some new little bit of understanding of superconductors, which I wouldn't have been able to even summarize like you did. So it does sound great.
And I love that this character felt real to me. There's a point where she's struggling with motivation and to work on a project. They've run a big analysis of something that has basically failed. And they're having to go back and she's having to really just recompute and she's procrastinating. And I love the way she's supposed to be working on this programming language, setting it all up, and she's got in one window. And in her other window, she's watching YouTube videos and British horticultural shows. She says, British horticulture was very soothing and contained just enough science to hold my attention. And that made me laugh.
I feel the same way about baking. I don't watch any American baking shows, but I'll watch anyone that are British.
I loved it so much. I haven't really read anything about it. I haven't read any reviews. I'm not sure how it's gone down, and it's only just come out here. I'm curious to see what people think of it. I want to hear more conversation about it.
I like the micro genre of winning a particular prestigious prize. I feel like I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank on what the actual title of the book is, but there's a book called like the National Book Award winner, or How I Won a Pulitzer. I feel like this is like a micro genre that I feel like you could put all these together because prizes govern our lives in ways that we are okay with and some ways that we aren't.
But the thing is, if you're going to do it, you've got to be able to pull it off, right? I think Dave Eggers did with a heartbreaking work of Staggering Genius. I think actually Julius Taranto has done a pretty good job with How I Won a Nobel Prize.
It makes me think of a book that we read in my So Many Damn Books Patreon book club.
Oh, yeah.
I'm amazed at what they choose. I put on a couple titles, but I also take recommendations and then have everybody vote. And I could not ever predict what they will choose. I've been wrong every single time when I'm like, oh, clearly this is going to win. And so I had never heard of this book, Nonfiction, by Julie Myerson.
Oh, right.
And she lives in London. And this book is about a mother dealing with their drug addict adult daughter. And it's called nonfiction because it's based on, I guess this was a big UK scandal, her true memoir of raising her son as he was dealing with his drug addiction. And so this is a daughter. The nonfiction comes from the feelings, I think, that she was feeling and not necessarily the truth of what happened in her own life. But it won me over. I came into it thinking like, okay, I'm going to slog through this because it wasn't on my radar. I had never heard of it. It just isn't the sort of book I ever gravitate towards. A mother-daughter relationship torn asunder by drug addiction. I'm usually skipping past that to something a little more high concept, or just the other thing that's happening is showing all of the other ways it's messing with her life. And there's an affair that she's having in the midst of everything. And you feel that affair so differently because you can see how much of an escape it is and how she needs to have someone who isn't having their heart broken daily like her and her husband are to project onto and to find any comfort in. And so as much as you're questioning her, or in the horror movie way of don't go in there, stop that, you're hurting everybody that you love, you really come away with an understanding of the emotional reality and how you are devastated and you'll find anything that'll make you feel a little bit better. And addiction for drugs versus addiction to the type of feeling that somebody can give you, those are all nice thematic juxtapositions that she's up to. And it's also the barest prose. It's stark and I guess you could say quiet for these huge emotions that she's depicting. It's very considered and careful and barely over 200 pages. So it doesn't keep you in misery. It really is skating around things, which was a very impressive read. And everybody in the book club reacted to it so viscerally. Everybody was really pulling at it. It surprised me how everybody really got into it. I don't ask a star rating after a book club, but I would think that it was one of these, everybody was a little surprised that they liked it as much as they did. And that, I feel, is the thing that happens after all book clubs for me. Every meeting we've had, I've walked away liking the book more than when I walked in. Do you feel that for your book?
Yeah, definitely. Or even, I might still have my original opinions, but I love having tested them against someone else's opinions. And sometimes I'll change my mind. Or I love it when someone will say something that helps me see a book in a new light. Everyone sees different things in books and everyone brings their own experience to reading a book, right? But brilliantly through these conversations, you get to share those different experiences, which to me enhances the pleasure. I love the conversations about books so much. I sometimes think I like that more than I like reading the actual books.
This Patreon book club is my first book club. I never was in a book club before this, partially because I am a very picky reader and I don't want other people picking my books for me. I'll pick. But it turns out that I'm all right with that. I feel like I missed out. I should have been in book clubs this whole time.
Well, it's true, as Laura and I always say, if you only ever choose the books you think you're going to like, you don't tend to get surprised in the same way or read outside of your comfort zone in the same way. And that's what book club's great for, I think. Getting you to read something that you never normally would have picked up.
What else have you just finished reading?
I feel like I need to talk about butter. Butter, as I would say. Butter, as you might say. And I don't know how a Japanese person would say it because I didn't have a chance to check. But this is a translation from the Japanese of a novel by Asako Yuzuki that was a huge hit in Japan. It was a bestseller there. The author, Asako Yuzuki, was born in Tokyo in 1981, won various awards for her early work, has been nominated multiple times for the Naoki Prize. I assume it's some kind of prestigious prize. And her novels have been adapted for television, radio, and film. So in Japan, she's young, but she's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing I was really interested in...
It's like a brick. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting that you noticed that. It's 455 pages long. It's translated by Polly Barton. For the podcast book club, we did a little bit of a deep dive into Japanese literature at the beginning of the year. We read Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, which is an amazing short stream of consciousness novel that I really enjoyed. And then I had a very interesting conversation with two people who know a lot about Japan and Japanese literature. And I ended up reading Polly Barton's memoir of her time in Japan. It's about learning Japanese, but it's also about the process of translation. It's about her own experiences. It's about this cultural gulf that you can never really fully transcend. And I loved it so much. And so I was all like, yay, great, Polly Barton. I want to read something else that Polly Barton has been connected to. I think what I discovered about this is, of course, a good translator is always going to be invisible. I guess they do their work best when you don't have any sense at all of the voice of a translator and really you're just purely getting the author's voice. And it turns out that I'm less interested in the work of Asako Yuzuki when it comes to it. You're always like, I feel like you always are someone who looks for positive in everything you read. And I feel maybe, I don't know, I feel, I don't want to be mean about it. I should say what it is. So the basic setup is it's a woman who is a serial killer. There are various men that she was connected with who have died and she has been imprisoned. And the thing is, the evidence was all circumstantial. The only thing that linked these men together was this woman. Her name is Kaji. She's been arrested and is awaiting trial. And there is a journalist, Rika, a young female journalist, who is interested in her story, wants to get the interview, as does every media outlet in Japan. Everyone is fascinated by this woman and her story. So Rika finds a way in because she asks this woman, Kaji, about her cooking methods. One of the things that Kaji was known for was her interest in cooking. She had attended this very prestigious cookery school. And so Rika finds this way in where she writes to her and she asks her about her recipe for bœuf bourguignon. And on the basis of that, Kaji grants her an interview, and so she goes to the prison. And then it's almost this sort of Hannibal Lecter, the prisoner having a psychological effect on the person coming into their space to see them. Kaji starts teasing out this promise of this interview. I'll speak to you, but you have to do this first. And she starts setting her these little tasks. And the little tasks are to do with food. And so one of the first things she tells her to do is that she has to go home and she has to make herself some white rice, add a little bit of soy sauce, and then a pat of butter. Not any butter, Échiré butter, which is this very refined French brand. I've had it. It's completely delicious. So she has to have this special butter and put it on there. And so she tries this journalist, and it's unbelievably good. So it's this gradual unfolding of this quite shut down in lots of ways person, this female journalist, discovering a certain freedom and losing some of her inhibitions. And I think what's interesting about the novel is the way that it's exploring why women in her position, professional women, feel so constrained. You know, why do they feel they have to look a certain way? Why do they feel they have to diet? Why can't they be free to speak their minds and say what they really think? And so at its most interesting, I feel like that's what it's exploring. And Kaji, the serial killer, is a woman of appetites. She doesn't care what people think of them. Her relationships with these men were all about pleasure and about giving them what they wanted, but as it served her own purpose. And so there's a gradual loosening maybe of these boundaries that Rika has set around herself. And there's a friend, Reiko, who is struggling to conceive a child with her husband and is very caught up in what her identity is as a result. She thought she was going to be a housewife, bringing up children, looking after them, but in fact that's not the way her life has turned out. She gave up her career and now she doesn't really know what she's doing. She also then becomes very transfixed by the case. And I suppose the other reason I find it hard to talk about is because I did finish it, but only because I skipped a chunk. So about 2/3 of the way, when I'd read about 300 pages, just was a morass. I was just finding it such slow going. And then there's a big point of view shift where it goes into Reiko's point of view. And I was just like, oh, I can't go on this journey. I can't follow this new character, this other character. And I don't see what's going to be interesting about it if I do. So then I skipped ahead. And I did finish it. There's a very interesting scene where Rika decides that she's going to cook a turkey for this collection of people that she knows that you've gradually got to know throughout the book. They all end up convening at her apartment. She roasts this turkey and it's delicious. I found it quite bizarre because obviously to me and probably to you too, turkey has quite specific associations as food. It's not something you'd eat.
Especially in its regular bird form and not sliced for a sandwich.
Exactly. Like the whole turkey roasted in the oven. That's Christmas basically here, or maybe Thanksgiving there. So it has very specific cultural associations for us. And so it felt very weird to me the way that this turkey was it was the centerpiece of this. Like it would have made more sense to me if it was like suckling pig or something. It was so strange. It was this thing about this turkey. I didn't get it. But I enjoyed where it ended up. I just felt like there was no narrative drive to it. There was nothing pulling me through it. Even when you do get drip bits of information about the characters and why things might have happened the way that they did, it wasn't ever really very interesting. And I felt bad the whole time that I was reading it, that I wasn't enjoying it more. And when I finished it, little quote marks around the word finished, I'm going to say that I finished it. I found myself asking a different question, which is, why did I want to like this so much?
Yeah.
Is it because it's a new book that's had a lot of publicity, I think is flying off the shelves? I don't want to stop people buying something that they think they might enjoy. I guess more I want them to read it for themselves and then tell me what they thought of it. So I can have that conversation about it that I'm dying to have with someone else who's read it. And I'm happy that Polly Barton, whose work I admire very much, got to translate this nice, chunky novel for which I hope and trust she was well paid. And that maybe that now frees her up to work on something that I would enjoy more than this.
I am fascinated by the translator life and the whole project of how are you going to bring these things over into a new language, that it still makes sense even though the conventions of the languages are different.
Mm.
That's a absolutely fascinating thing. And I find that it means that I read a lot of books about translators.
Yeah.
Novels about translators. Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's the next book for the So Many Damn Books book club, is about a major author is releasing their new book. And so all the translators are going to the author's house to get their copy so that they can translate it into their specific languages. And all the translators are just known as the language that they speak. It's called The Extinction of Irena Ray. And all the authors show up to translate this book, and then the author disappears. So it's about what they do with the house as they work on translating to see if maybe there's a clue in the manuscript.
Who's that by?
That's by Jennifer Croft.
Oh.
I'm not sure if it's
Who is
come
a
across
translator?
there yet. Yeah.
Of course, she translates famously Olga Tokarczuk, doesn't she?
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Nobel Prize winning Olga Tokarczuk. I think I'm right. We did her book, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, for book club a long time ago, which I loved.
Yeah. I haven't read any of Tokarczuk, although I really am interested in the Extremely Enormous book that won an award. Like, there's something about the big, huge swing that interests me.
Yeah, the Books of Jacob.
Yeah.
I started it. I read about a third of it. It wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it. I was. But
just too long.
It requires exactly long, uninterrupted stretches of concentration. And actually, that's something I never have. I realized it wasn't doing it justice, reading it in these little snippets the way I was. So I put it aside, but I'll go back to it one day.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's great. I love her work. And I would assume then from the translations that I've read that Jennifer Croft is an excellent translator. How interesting to play around with that idea.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really great. I'm literally just in the first 5 pages, but I'm, of course, have to finish it because I'm going to be running the book club about it. So
you've got that to read. Is there anything else you've read recently that's in your mind?
Yes. I feel like everybody's going to be reading this book. It will probably win all of the awards. I think maybe every single one.
Is this James?
James by Percival Everett. Have you read it too?
No. I picked it up in the bookshop yesterday and put it down again slightly reluctantly because I've got a lot of stuff I've got to read right now and I won't have time to get to it. So I resisted the temptation.
It's funny that you already knew what I was talking about just by... It will. I just think it will because it is the most enormous swing to take the pinnacle of American literature, some might say, Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and say, I think I've got a new idea here that is going to blow this thing wide open. And that's absolutely what he did. It's about Jim. It's his perspective. It follows a lot of the plot of Huckleberry Finn, but it's through Jim's eyes. One of the very first things that he does with the character is he makes him highly literate and constantly trying to write his own story down. But he's code switching. Anytime he's around white people, he's acting dumb and speaking as he does in the text of Huckleberry Finn. But as soon as he's away from white people, as soon as he's around just black people, he's code switching and speaking very highly. And actually, he has a little school with the kids to teach them how to successfully code switch before he has to go on the run. And of course, when you read Huckleberry Finn, you get the sense, Huck fakes his own death. And it's implied that it's a less weight in Mark Twain's version. But of course, in Jim's mind, when he hears that Huck has faked his own death, he's, oh my God, I can't go home. I'm going to be killed. Because he has a wife and daughter they'll probably get hurt along with me. And it's just so powerful. And it's still funny and it's still thrilling. It's this page-turning thriller because even though you know how it turns out, you don't know what Percival Everett is going to be doing with this. The whole time you're wondering what thread he's going to pull at next from the narrative because he doesn't stay in one mode. It was read by Dominic Hoffman, the audiobook. I would say to listen to it because to hear the voice change along with the rhetoric is magical. And Dominic Hoffman is a stage actor mostly, although he's got one of those IMDb pages where you're like, oh, I think I must have seen him and just never realized he's been in everything.
I need to look him up because I'm not familiar with that name.
I wasn't either, but you look at and you're like, oh yeah, I probably heard of that show. I remember that show. He's always been like Officer Number 3 or something, but it's an incredible performance and it deserves all of the accolades and everything. And this is my first Percival Everett novel, and it's actually his first novel with a major publisher. I think it's his 12th or 13th book, and all the other ones have come out on independent publishers. So this is his big swing as well. I think next I'm going to read the book that the movie was based on, American Fiction. That's based on a Percival Everett book called Erasure. And I think I'm going to read that next because I was absolutely blown away. This is a guy who is, I can't believe I haven't read more from him already. Everyone's always been saying read The Trees or read Erasure, and I, like I said, hate being told what to read. So there's a little bit of a contrarian. Yeah, I'll read it on my time. But I'm glad I'm joining the chorus of everybody talking about how incredible James is.
Yeah,
really
I was going to ask if it was funny because we did The Trees, because I think it was shortlisted for the Booker, not last year, but the year before, was it? A couple of years ago, which quick internet search reveals was the year that The 7 Moons of Marley Almeida won, which actually I thought was fair enough. That was really good. I don't know if you've read that, but it was an excellent book. But The Trees was the other one. We really were like, oh, wow, this is something special. One of the things I remember about it was how funny it was, like laugh out loud funny. So I was curious to know whether James was funny, because it feels like if he's riffing on the original work. I don't think I've ever read Huckleberry Finn. I have this very strong mental image of it, but that comes from the TV series, which was screened here when I was growing up. I'm assuming it was an American show. And definitely thinking about those characters immediately, those are the images that come to my mind's eye. But you had read the book.
Yeah. I don't know if you can escape American elementary school without being made to read it.
That's interesting because it's long, isn't it?
It is. I think we probably read it over the course of a long time.
Yeah, I think in the same way here, you pretty much can't get through secondary school without doing some Dickens novel. Whether it's Great Expectations or Oliver Twist, you're going to do one of them.
I just read Great Expectations this last year. Amazing book. It deserves all the accolades. Dickens is all right by me.
He knew a thing or two, that Charles
I know
Dickens.
He was asking. I know he was worried about whether a modern American would like him. And it's all right, man. You can stop your worry.
He can rest easy in his grave.
Exactly. Just to switch gears into actual nonfiction, I bought this book that I'm so excited about. It's a comic biography of Charles Schultz.
The Peanuts guy.
Yes. And it is drawn slightly in his style, and it really follows his childhood. And if you've read any Charles Schultz biographies, you'll be familiar with some of these story beats, but they've been reimagined into his style of comic strips. It's amazing. I also think it's interesting that it's 2 Italians who wrote the book. It feels like a very American comic strip and a very American thing, but it's worldwide. I know the Peanuts characters are known the world over, but it's a magical way of course, a comic biography of the father of modern cartooning. Of course. Are you a Peanuts fan or?
I recently rediscovered them because in my little free library that I run, which is attached to my daughter's school, sometimes books just turn up in there and I know that if they're basically put there for me, it wants me to find them. And it gave me these 2 Peanuts books, old ones from back in the day.
Yeah.
And
like little collections.
Yeah, because there's a whole series of them. And I picked them up and immediately was transported back to my childhood when I used to read them. And so I took them and brought them home and I've been reading them with my 6-year-old who... I think, it's interesting. Obviously, she's got a very different level that she's accessing them on than me. She's very interested in, which is the character, is it Linus, the one who carries his blanket around the whole time? She loves him. She's very interested in that character. We both of us puzzle over the baseball things that we just don't understand at all.
I remember as a 6-year-old reading Peanuts, they're always writing letters and they say to whom it may concern. And as a kid, I had not seen whom before. And I remember bringing it to my mom and saying, what is Wom? Who is Wom? Who is this Wom? Yeah, it is. Talk about just referencing the world of the time that there'll be a reference to a figure skater from the 80s or something at some point where you're just like, who is Snoopy trying to skate like? I don't understand this reference at all. Like, it's completely lost to time.
But coming back to them as an adult,
still so funny.
You realise they are so full of charm and warmth, and they're really magical. Such a joy to talk books with you. It's been a great treat.
Oh, yeah. This is wonderful. I'm so glad you invited me on. This is so great.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. And I'm happy that I know there'll be plenty more podcasts coming from you for me to listen to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to stop. So.
That's nearly it for this episode. Books mentioned were The Eyes and the Impossible by Dave Eggers, and we also talked about a heartbreaking work of staggering genius and his McSweeney's magazine. How I Won a Nobel Prize by Julius Taranto, Non-Fiction by Julie Myerson, Butter by Asako Yuzuki, translated by Polly Barton, Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, 50 Sounds by Polly Barton, The Disappearance of Irena Ray by Jennifer Croft, James by Percival Everett, and we also mentioned Erasure and The Trees, and last but not least, Funny Things, a comic strip biography of Charles M. Schultz by Luca Debus and Francesco Mateuzzi. This episode of the Book Club Review was edited and produced here in London by me, Kate Slotover. If you'd like to get more from the Book Club Review and also support the pod and help me make more shows, you can sign up to our Patreon account. For a small monthly amount, you'll get extra episodes and a weekly newsletter themed around book recommendations. At the higher tier, you can join our podcast book club. Next up for us is Cahokia Jazz, the new novel from one of my absolute favourite writers, Frances Spufford. I would love to read and discuss it with you. We meet over Zoom on the last Sunday of the month. Find all the details at the link in the show notes or search patreon.com/The Book Club Review. More generally, you can keep an eye on what we're up to on Instagram and Threads at Book Club Review Podcast, or get in touch direct at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. In our upcoming episode, we're focusing on the rich pickings to be found in the world of non-fiction, with some essential recommendations from Tom Rowley, owner and proprietor of Backstory Bookshop in South London. Tom and I will be running through some favourite reads, from new releases to backlist gems, and Tom also gives us a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the evolution of the Backstory magazine, issue 2 of which has just launched, and which Tom describes as the antidote to weighty literary journals, a colourful, zippy and occasionally provocative celebration of books and bookshops. That episode is coming soon, but for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.